The atrocities that have happened in Israel have almost universally been defended in some way, shape, or form by the American left by diverting the conversation away from the terrorism that happened caused by Hamas and egged on by the Arab world, egged on by Iran, which approved Hamas to go into southern Israel and kill a bunch of innocent people. They have diverted away from that, and they have focused almost entirely on the issue of Palestinian liberation. Indeed, this was the sort of rallying call of a recent Democratic Socialists of America rally in New York, which essentially was a rally, they call it, for Palestinian liberation, where they said the following in response to all the events.
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Palestine will be free.
For those of you who know, from the river to the sea basically is a phrase that means that the area of Palestine actually encompasses the broader area that Israel claims, and from the river to the sea is oftentimes a call to destroy Israel to ensure that Palestine has all of its supposed territory back. So essentially it's a call for mass genocide. I don't care what anyone says. That's essentially what it is. When you say that they shall be free, it's a call for mass genocide, and Hamas uses it as well. But even beyond that, at that same rally, there was a speaker who received mass applause when he made the following comment about a rave party that happened on the border between Gaza and Israel, which was a rave party for peace between the two sides.
Party where they were having a great time until the resistance came in electrified hang gliders and took at least several dozen hipsters. But I'm sure they're doing very fine despite what the New York Post says.
He referred to the over 200 young people killed who wanted peace as a bunch of hipsters who got what was coming to them, and they received applause. Now, I'm not just going to pick on the left here, because it would be incredibly incorrect for me to simply pick on the left and pick on people like Vaush, who go out and say that when people resist, you should expect this kind of stuff, and other people on the left who, if they don't explicitly ignore and deflect by going towards the topic of liberation, they will instead try to make it an issue of both sides, like Cori Bush, who said that both sides need to stop the violence, or like Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, that tyrant, who had the audacity to say, instead of actually calling the region by its name, Israel, had the audacity to say that region, the violence in that region has to stop, regardless of what it is, whether it's the deflection by defaulting to Palestinian liberation, or whether it's the complete and utter both-sidism that comes from a corruption of moral understanding. One thing is clear, the left is not the only aggressor in this. There have been radical Islamists across the West, in Western countries that they migrated to, many of them, and then, of course, children they were born into them from parents who migrated there, and they have been saying atrocious things like this. And in the UK, there was mass celebration once on the very night of the news that Hamas had gone and massacred a bunch of innocent people. So it's very obvious to me, this is a very strange phenomenon happening. The radical left, the socialists on the left, the progressives, those who are bound by the idea of equity, have sided with the radical Islamists whose worldview is not only entirely different, but whose vision for society and vision for political order is also entirely different. And yet, the contradiction between these two worldviews, the radical Islamists, who have an old world barbaric view of the human being and believe that jihad, force, is a reflection of God's will, and by doing so they demean the idea of God to the physical, as opposed to understanding that God transcends human activity, he transcends human behavior and any real understanding, and so force cannot encapsulate his mercy. But jihad says, oh no, God is part of that activity. And the left that has a similar materialistic view, but says that the advancement of oppressed classes is important, and equity is the principle that informs that. These two different worldviews that would lead to two radically different outcomes have yet united because there is a uniting strand between them. The Islamic world views Palestine as a cause celebrate against Israel, who their own texts, the Jews, condemn, and the progressive left and the socialist left view the idea of oppressed classes and oppressed groups as more precious than the lives and the deaths of individuals in other groups that they don't consider oppressed. Socialism really is a murderous and inhuman ideology because it will reduce all of society to competing classes, some who have, and they will oftentimes ascribe the value of those classes to who has certain materials and resources and who doesn't, and they will then construct political order on this distinction. They will criminalize distinction by saying the presence of poverty and the presence of wealth in a society is presence of injustice. And then after criminalizing that distinction, they will then make a value judgment about the wealthy, most of the time saying they're exploiters and they're evil, and about the marginalized, ascribing a universal label of benevolence to them, regardless of anything that happens in that group, and they will then proceed from that premise. This is why the socialists can justify mass murder, or can justify, rather, violence in the name of furthering a marginalized class, because they view this as a matter of competing forces, one of which are trying to fight supposedly against exploitation. There's a reason why they can completely make light of the deaths of people at a rave party who wanted peace, who were not partisans, because those people, they believe, were simply roadblocks and obstacles for the resistors, as that person said in that video, that are trying to fight against the evil other class that seeks to suppress them. This is the class group collectivist worldview that allows a socialist to completely and utterly endorse inhuman atrocities, because the focus is not on the human, the focus is on the abstract narrative. And for the radical Islamists, their worldview, as I mentioned, views this as a religious matter, as a sacred matter. Their understanding of God and how to serve Him is also really tied up in the use of force to further their ends. Now, of course, it's not just also the radical Islamist and the socialist uniting together, even though their goals are contradictory. The socialists would say, most of them would say, and at least in America, if they're in Eastern Europe, maybe not, but most of them would say that the ensuring LGBTQ rights is important. When you go over to Gaza, you go over to Egypt, you go over to Iran that's funding Hamas, they will kill gay people. So it's very odd. Politics makes strange metaphors, as the old axiom says. But there's also people like Mia Khalifa, a porn star, that basically said, she basically praised what was happening as a matter of resistance. And Sneeko, who has aligned himself with the far right, who are also supporting Hamas, by the way, in Palestine, who's also said this is something that should be, should be supported in the name of liberation. Liberation. Well, the truth is, my friends, if the Palestinian people are not Hamas, I do not believe that the Palestinian people are Hamas, even though they do elect Hamas time and time again, then the Palestinian people are not being liberated by a group that claims to represent them, but instead acts against their own interest all the time. And yet, maybe the Palestinian people have an emotional affectation to Hamas because Hamas promises some kind of deliverance from the condition that they believe they have, which, by the way, isn't the worst in the world. It's not ideal, of course, but it's not the worst in the world. More on that later. And so that's why they support Hamas. And so that's why we can be empowered to support ideas that even on the surface seem like they help us. But in all reality, they don't help us. They actually go against what we need to survive. As I mentioned, you cannot build a society off of enmity. You cannot build a society off of needless conflict, because society and civilization is sustained by justice, which simply is the respecting of other people's stuff and your promises to them and your oaths to them. But it's then empowered and emboldened by charity and by goodwill. And by painting either side with a broad brush, you're not engaging in charity and goodwill. And by allowing the slaughter of innocent people to be used as a political football to further your wicked worldview is not only a rejection of charity and goodwill, it is sheer malevolence. And that is what we are seeing coming from socialists who don't have a proper conception of man. That's what we're seeing coming from radical Islamists who believe jihad and Sharia are their standards of value, as opposed to the indefensible value of the individual. And that's what we are seeing from these loudmouth influencers who really know even less than I do about the whole history. And I don't know that much, but I know enough to be at least somewhat competent on it. I know what I know what I don't know. Who just sound off to hundreds of thousands and millions of people in support of a murderous regime. We must avoid an error of thinking that allows the left and others to justify the atrocities, or at least ignore the atrocities, and instead point towards the issue of Palestinian liberation, and it is this, the issue of proximity. I've talked about the idea of proximity ethics many, many times. And proximity ethics, putting it simply, is simply the idea that you can judge if something is good or bad on the basis of what it is close to. Not what it's associated with, what it's close to. Association is a different kind of thing. And so, for example, a proximity ethicist could say that I believe eating apples is good because those apples that you're eating are associated with my apple orchard business that I run and sustains my livelihood. Well, eating apples may be great, but that has nothing to do with your own economic advantage and everything to do with the content of the apples. When your only reference in this particular situation to Palestinian liberation is mass terrorism conducted by an organization that has been empowered by the Palestinian people, then you are essentially, by proximity, trying to equate the cause of Palestinian liberation with terrorism. And in fact, you're not trying to actually do that. And by doing that, you commit a grievous moral error. You fail to understand the distinctions necessary to sound moral, historical, and philosophical thinking. You fail to understand the distinctions necessary to understanding the complex situation on the ground in Israel. You just fail because you are indicting an entire situation on the basis of what it's close to, not on the basis of its merits. This happens, of course, on both sides. This happens a lot, but it's particularly happening on the American left. But again, their worldview indicts people on the basis of what they're close to. If you're close to wealth, the American left will say, then you have to pay your fair share, which presumes that there is A, a fair share, which I'm not sure there quite is, or B, that wealthy people don't contribute enough to society, which is an absolute lie, or C, that they don't pay enough taxes, which in the case of some wealthy people like Warren Buffett, who literally will voluntarily donate his money to the Treasury Department, is not true. But all these presumptions don't matter because the association of wealth and poverty must mean there's injustice. These are mediocre minds forged by proximity. That's what we're seeing here. They believe the Palestinians are proximal to what they see as injustice in the worldview, and Hamas is proximal to that. Therefore, they can wipe their hands clean, turn the other way, and justify, by omission, the slaughter of people. There's one thing to say that you believe there are problems between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Palestine, and that Palestine deserves X, Y, Z. That's one position that a person can hold, which is reasonable, and even though I may not entirely agree with it, that's still reasonable. It's another thing to say, to respond to terrorist attacks by saying Palestinian liberation is important. No, that is not a reasonable nor moral response. That is a response mired in evil. But perhaps, again, as I mentioned, this is not simply evil for the sake of ignorance. This is intentional evil, bequeathed by worldviews that don't mind using tools and tactics that are immoral to achieve their ends. The ends never justify the means. If the ends and the means, or the means or the ends individually, are conceived on false ideas. And I submit to you today, my friends, that the ideas that the American left seem to have about the situation, and the ideas that many others who rule by proximity and not rationality seem to have about the situation, are not ruled on truth. They are based on falsehood and error. It's one thing to have an opinion. It's the other to have an opinion built on falsehood, built on stilts that don't hold up when the wind blows just a little bit. We should really recognize, my friends, that there's also a problem of identity here. In America, we have a certain way of doing things, a certain moral framework that our country doesn't always live up to, but the principles of our country necessitate as a matter of moral and political analysis. And yet, leftism, especially socialism, is a European import that has come into America and has suggested so many different things about our nation and so many different programs for our society that run antithetical to these universal values that we're built upon. And so when you have a group of people willing to justify the countless amounts of slaughter in another land to pursue a political agenda, what are they willing to justify on our home turf? This is one of the reasons why I continue to call for mandatory citizenship revocations to any and everyone who rejects even one single principle that our country is built upon. It's not just a national security issue, which it is. It's fundamentally an issue of moral consistency, a consistency that America needs to persist in this world. You can have whatever opinion you want to have on the Israel-Palestine situation. But here's what you can't do. Well, you can, but you shouldn't do. You shouldn't try to justify evil or ignore evil by lapsing into moral relativism and trying to equate what's happening on the ground, or what happened on the ground in that instance, with both sides. You also shouldn't, in my opinion, try to use proportion and statistics and numbers as a standard of value without actually considering why those proportions or statistics or numbers exist. A concrete case of this is in the case of how many people were killed on both sides. That's not what's important. What's important is how were those people killed? Why were they killed? Was it collateral damage? Was it intentional? That's what's important. You also, most certainly, should never view situations in the abstract terms of competing groups that have pre-established identities, one of which you value and the other which you hate, to justify omitting the concrete facts of any given situation. You should instead try to be as charitable, try to be as humble, and most importantly, try to be as humane in your thinking as possible. But the American left has shown that they don't want to do this. The Western left has shown they don't want to do this. Instead, they would rather ally with jihadists who, when given the chance to take the levers of authority, would have them as the first people on the execution block for their alternative lifestyles in defiance to the goals of Sharia. Park that and think about it for a second. My friends, I love you guys so much. If you love me, like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel. I love you guys so much. If you want to help me get messages out there, donate to me on my Patreon, my PayPal, all kind of areas, my locals. Help me keep lights on and help me bring good content to you. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.